Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this interactive webinar entitled Building a Foundation of Trust, the Essentials to Understanding Enterprise Encryption Key Management. I'm David Brow, a security journalist with CSO Australia, and it's my pleasure to be your host for the next hour. The latest report on Australia's Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme, or NDB, revealed that nearly 1,000 serious data breaches were reported to authorities since the scheme came into effect just over a year ago. Some of these breaches involve millions of records that have been compromised, and unless those records were encrypted, they're now in the public domain. That's your personal information and that of your customers dumped onto a content sharing site somewhere or posted for sale on the dark web. It is, of course, best to improve security practices to prevent data breaches altogether, but conventional wisdom now says that breaches are inevitable and that a critical part of cybersecurity planning is to minimize exposure to breaches and to be ready to respond quickly and effectively when something goes wrong. Encrypting data at rest and in transit is a powerful option, but one that not every business has adopted. In fact, the recent Global Encryption Trends study found that just half of Australian companies had developed consistent encryption plans or strategies. To be fair, some 72% are encrypting payment-related data, which puts us well ahead of the 55% global average. However, that says nothing about the broad range of other types of data that we must protect every day. Managing encryption is another issue entirely. Fully 68% of Australian companies reported having issues managing the signing keys for their encryption, much worse than the 51% global average. Australians recognize the value of hardware security modules, or HSMs, which were flagged as important for key management by 75% of respondents, which is much higher than the 60% global average. However, the lingering challenges with key management suggest that many organizations are still struggling to roll out and manage encryption across their organizations. That's why we're here today. Over the next hour, you'll be hearing from 3 experts who will share their knowledge and best practices around encryption and key management. Our speakers include Richard Brown, founder and managing director of Cogito Group, Dr. Mark Gregory, an associate professor with RMIT University in Melbourne, who's focused on network engineering and internet privacy, and James Cook, regional director for Australia and New Zealand with nCipher, who have kindly sponsored today's webinar. We'll have some presentations, Q&A sessions, and viewer polls, followed by a panel Q&A session where you, the viewers, will get the chance to ask our experts anything you want or need to know about encryption and key management. If you'd like to submit questions while the webinar is in progress, please enter them into the panel on the right side of your screen. We'll try to get to all of them within the time that we have. Can I also direct your attention to the panel where you'll find that there are some handouts that are available for download. I highly encourage you to click on them and have a read either now or later on to support the content of the webinar and to learn a bit more about the subject matter today. So let's get started. Our first speaker, James Cook, is Regional Director for Australia and New Zealand with nCipher. James has over 20 years experience working with world-leading organizations to protect their data. He has worked across a range of industry sectors and geographies, helping companies deliver trust, integrity, and control to their business-critical information and applications. James has a degree in business studies and economics from the University of Greenwich, London, and previously led the Tails e-security business in South Asia, based in Delhi. James, it's great to have you here today. Take it away.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here, and good morning to everybody who's taken the time to join today's webinar. As David said, I represent nCipher. I'm sure a good number of you on the webinar today are familiar with nCipher, but for those of you who don't know us, nCipher is a leader in the general purpose hardware security market, providing trusted cryptography for a wide range of applications, including encryption and digital signing. Now, in his introduction, David referenced a number of statistics, which is a really nice lead into what I'll be talking about for the next 15 minutes or so. Because I think the best way to understand this area is to get a view from the real world. And certainly I don't think there's any better way to do that than to share the output of the Global Encryption Trends study. And we've recently released the 2019 version of that particular study. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in a little bit more detail today. Now, some of you might be familiar with this particular survey, but for those of you who aren't, it's actually conducted on our behalf by an organization called Ponemon, who are a US-based organization. They're a very well-respected research organization who specialize in the area of data privacy and information security. And the aim of the survey is to examine how the use of encryption has evolved over time and how it's impacted organization security posture. And this survey is now in its 14th year, and it's grown every year in terms of both the number of people that we survey and also the number of countries that are covered by the survey as well. And as you can see from the slide there, this year we focused on 14 countries and had nearly 6,000 people respond to the survey. So it really is very comprehensive and one of the best recognized surveys in this particular space. So in terms of the running order for today, I'm going to kick off with some broad trends. So I'm going to be talking about and sharing some results about why people are using encryption, what applications organizations are using encryption with. I'll then also draw out some highlights and differences between different countries and different vertical industries as well. And obviously, I'm aware that many people on the call today are clearly from Australia. So where possible, I'm going to pull out some of the Australian specific stats as well. Next, we'll hit on some drivers for encryption use, the types of threats that encryption protects against, how compliance and cloud adoption have influenced the use of encryption. So we're really going to kind of focus in on those areas. And then clearly, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that people are seeing, the major stumbling blocks that organizations hit as they look to expand their use of encryption. And we'll also touch on some strategies for dealing with some of those challenges. Next, we'll go into some solutions and ways that people can kind of manage some of these problems. And as you would imagine, being an HSM company, we're going to be talking about HSMs in that space, but also we're going to be touching on some of the wider key management challenges as well. And finally, I'll wrap up with some recommendations and conclusions drawn from the study. I will say this is a very comprehensive study, as David said earlier on. There are some handouts available, and a full copy of the survey is available. I'd absolutely encourage you to download it, because I would typically take about 40-45 minutes to deliver this presentation. So I'm having to really try and pull out some of the highlights, which hopefully will pique your interest to download the full survey and enjoy it at your leisure. So let's kick off with some initial highlights here. And the great thing about this survey is that it's been running for 14 years. And what that enables us to do is to observe some trends and some changes in the encryption space over that consistent period of time. One of the things that we've consistently seen in this survey every single year is a growth in the amount of organizations who have a consistent enterprise-wide encryption strategy. And clearly from our perspective, that's really encouraging to see. And this year's no different, exactly the same as it has been in previous years, more growth. It's worth looking at some of the individual countries that are kind of top of that list in terms of deploying an enterprise-wide strategy. There's kind of the usual suspects that we see each year. So Germany, the USA, the UK is typically there, but also encouragingly, you'll see Australia in there as well. But even so, if you look at the, Australia and the UK, still only running at just over 50%. So yeah, I think there's still, we're heading in the right direction, but there's still work to do. Now, the interesting thing I think about this year's survey is we measure 15 different encryption use cases, and that ranges across the board. So we're encrypting backups, storage, email, databases, and various others. And typically, when we've done this survey in the past, there'll be a couple of use cases that outgrow the others. They kind of have double-digit growth year on year. But I think this year's survey has been characterized by the fact that actually there aren't any huge shifts. What we've seen is just a consistent, steady growth across all use cases, which I think is really interesting to see. The other thing that's worth pointing out here as well that we've seen in terms of change is that historically, compliance has dominated in terms of drivers for people using encryption. The interesting thing this year is while compliance is still one of the main reasons, it's not the most important one. Other drivers have come into play. So people proactively looking to protect intellectual property, protect personal information, and also guard against specific threats. And in my opinion, this demonstrates some maturing of organizations thinking around encryption as they now understand that encryption is the right thing to do and the go-to way of protecting data, and they're doing it because it's the right thing to do rather than because they're being told to do it by a regulator. And I think that's a really encouraging move. So let's talk a little bit about some of the encryption use cases that we've seen from the survey. Where are people typically deploying encryption? And at the top of the chart there, we'll see the usual suspects. So, you know, things like encrypting internet communications, databases, backups, etc. They're always there. We typically see those every single year. But the interesting thing that we are seeing this year is that people are, while they're deploying those use cases as ever, they're also tightening the security insurance level around those use cases. So, for example, we're seeing increased use of HSMs with SSL application delivery controllers, you know, like your F5s and your Citrix and those guys. And we're also seeing people using HSMs more with their databases, for example. So the use cases are the same, but people are taking those use cases a little bit further and tightening up the security, which again is a really positive move. Another notable trend that we're seeing, particularly, is the growth in cloud use cases. And the reason why I think this is nice to see is that even 5 years ago, we just wouldn't have seen cloud use cases registering on the chart at all. And I think this shows us that organizations are now far more comfortable with hosting sensitive data in the cloud. And encryption clearly is a key enabler for this. It's also just worth spending a second and looking at the bottom of the list. And I know it's fairly low down, but for the first time, we're seeing the Internet of Things and Internet IoT use cases creeping into the top 15. And I can certainly comment on this from personal experience from customers that I speak with in Australia. And I've seen a marked increase in organizations rolling out IoT data protection projects, and that's across a number of industries. We're seeing it in customers in the manufacturing space, healthcare, mining, and others. So it's something that's been talked about for a long time, but it now seems to be turning into a reality as organizations recognize the potential security risks of having, in some cases, millions of connected devices. So some really interesting data coming out of that, I think. So we've established that people are doing more encryption. What are they looking for when they deploy encryption solutions? What's most important? And I think the big headline here is not necessarily what is top, it's what's not top. And that's because for I think every year in the survey to date, the number one feature that people look for is performance. Organizations don't want encryption to slow the business down, is the message that we've historically seen. My personal view is that betrays a view that encryption is potentially a little bit of a necessary evil. People are happy to have it as long as it doesn't get in the way. And perhaps we're seeing a maturity in terms of the products, certainly that are being used out there as well. The performance is no longer that issue, but I think also it betrays a certain amount of maturity in terms of the thought process of users. You know, they're looking at encryption differently, and I think that's really good to see. So enforcement of policy has now moved to the top spot, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of the reasons behind that, because we've got some specific sides that address that, because it's quite a key area. But the survey shows us that one reason that people are struggling to enforce policy is they're having more and more encryption tools to manage, and that causes some issues around enforcement. But we'll come back to that. And there's also a couple of others that are worth commenting on. As we can see, number 3 on the list is around the influence of the cloud, and in particular, organizations want the choice to deploy on-premise or in the cloud, but they don't want to compromise in terms of functionality or performance or indeed security. So that's interesting to see. And then 4th on the list there is key management. And I guess as encryption becomes more and more pervasive, more people are using encryption for more applications. Clearly, what that does do is that potentially means there are more keys out there, and that presents some key management challenges. And people understand that keys have life cycles. You have to track them, rotate them, take copies of them in order to be able to recover. But clearly, not so many as it creates a vulnerability. And organizations we find are really looking to seek out best practice in that area. So that's a little bit about some of the key features that people are looking for. Those on the call may feel differently, but that's what the research is telling us today. Now I've mentioned cloud a few times here, and obviously there's we've seen, certainly one of the key trends we've seen is that people are far more willing to host sensitive data in the cloud. You know, we can see from the numbers there, in this case, 83% of those are either putting sensitive data in cloud environments now or are planning to do so in the next couple of years. There's also, though, a trend, as we can see, for using multiple providers. And I have to say, to the credit of the public cloud providers, they've done a good job of building out their service offerings in order that it gives users the option to spread workloads across several providers. So that's really positive. Unfortunately, that's not without its challenges, because each provider is typically coming to the table with their own native tools for encryption and key management. And clearly, while that's great because it shows that they're focused on that area, what it can do is to mean that your admins end up with having to manage several tools to learn, which you know, can put stress on a function which more often than not is already under stress and understaffed. So little bit of a double-edged sword there. But also on top of that, you know, using multiple tools can also create difficulty in terms of enforcement as well, and getting some consistency around enforcement. So clearly what that tells us is that if we can, if there are tools out there that can span multiple clouds and also people's internal data center, that clearly is highly advantageous to organizations. So yeah, that's something that I think we'll see a lot more of moving forward. So obviously, as more people are deploying encryption, there's more encryption out there. I guess it's understandable that we're starting to see some challenges in that space as well. I guess the slightly disappointing thing is that we're not seeing progress in terms of enterprises doing a better job of finding all of their sensitive data. And now compliance has helped with this, is fair to say. So there are clearly as I'm sure everybody on the webinar is aware, there's a whole range of different regulations and compliance initiatives that are forcing organisations to protect their sensitive data, and that clearly has forced some more rigour around discovering where data is. But again, unfortunately, that's countered to some degree by the fact that there's clearly, as I've said before, a considerable growth in terms of multi-cloud and IoT implementations, and that just fundamentally creates more places for data to go. So yeah, so it's kind of like a balloon. You kind of squeeze it at one place, it bulges out in the other. So kind of good and bad, balancing itself out there. And the other point that's worth raising that we're seeing as well, there's also a challenge around, as we can see there at number 3, classifying what to encrypt. And it's clear that organisations are now expanding the scope of what is considered sensitive. Some types of data that you know 4 or 5 years ago would have been considered fairly benign, but now they're considered highly sensitive. So the definition of sensitive data is changing, which is introducing some challenges around, you know, classifying what it is that people should encrypt. So I thought that was a kind of interesting development. And in terms of continuing some of those encryption challenges, as I said we'd come back to this and spend a bit more time on it. And this is really focused around the number of encryption products that people are using. So as I said before, it's encouraging that more and more people are using encryption and clearly treating their data more sensitively. But clearly, what we can see is here that 63% of organisations are using more than 6 encryption products. Now, and typically many of those products will have their own tools to manage them. So subsequently, I guess it's no surprise that also means that a high proportion of people are experiencing pain with managing keys. So guess what? You have lots of encryption solutions out there, all with their own ways of managing the keys. That's typically going to create some problems around managing those keys, and it's going to make that process somewhat painful. Interesting though, I think it is worth again just coming back to Australia for a second. That this is an area where Australia came out very well. So despite the fact that clearly the earlier data shows that in Australia they're doing quite a high level of strategic encryption, that the average number of products that are being used to do that in Australia are below the average. So some positive news there. I should say as well, it's important to note that that using large numbers of encryption products is not the only reason why people struggle with key management. There are a number of other challenges. So you know, things like lack of ownership for the encryption and key management process, clearly under-resourcing, insufficient skills in certain areas. There is a significant issue in terms of silos within organizations and a lack of collaboration. And indeed, believe it or not, yes, a lot of people are still using manual methods to manage their keys, so spreadsheets and the like. And I guess that's probably you know, is no surprise that this is painful if people are doing that stuff. So there's a number of contributing factors in that space. So what are the threats that people are seeing to data? And I thought this was an important thing to point out, because the clear message that we're seeing is that the employee mistakes are still by far the biggest biggest threat to sensitive data. And it's important that, you know, this is good people with good intentions just doing the wrong thing. This is not people doing anything maliciously, you know. But I think it's really interesting to see that that's still the lion's share of issues come from that space. In fact, more than the next two put together. So you know, that's a really interesting stat, you know, in my view. The reasons for that could be many. Is it lack of skill? Is it the fact that people are overworked and overloaded? Is it because the tools just aren't up to the job, or they're not intuitive enough? I guess probably a combination of all of these factors. But it is nonetheless interesting. But my takeaway from this would be is, yeah, absolutely, you need to think about the threat from external hackers and potentially malicious insiders, but not at the expense of looking at the internal defenses against single points of human error. You know, that is a significant area of threat to most organizations, and worth a little bit of focus. So, you know, we've kind of highlighted some of the issues. So let's talk a little bit about some of the potential solutions to that. And as you would expect, as an HSM company, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of HSMs. So I'm sure most of you are aware, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the HSM technology, an HSM is a hardware security module. It's a certified, trusted platform for performing cryptographic operations and protecting keys. The way I like to look at it is that it allows you to harden an application and lock down its crypto processes. So if you're looking to you know, to build a gold standard in terms of secure crypto, you want to enable strict control and auditability over your keys. You want a protected way to implement and enforce policies for key usage. That is what an HSM does. I'm sure a lot of you guys know that, but worth pointing it out. I will say as well that one of the emerging trends that we are seeing is a requirement for good key quality. And a good source of entropy for key generation is actually quite hard to come by in the traditional computing world. And one of the things that HSMs typically can do is to provide a certified random number generator, and that kind of helps with that process. So, you know, potentially helps on a couple of fronts. And I guess that's it probably explains the stats that we're seeing here. So this year's survey saw a record use of HSM. So 47% of those surveyed telling us that they're currently users of HSMs. And interestingly, this year saw the highest year-on-year growth in terms of in the survey's history, which is, I guess, as an HSM manufacturer, that's good for us to see. Although, you know, the other thing that I guess from a local perspective, what we are seeing is a sort of a slight paradox in Australia. So Australian organisations are well above the global average in terms of HSMs being considered important for encryption and key management. But interestingly, they then fall below the global average in terms of actually deploying HSMs to do that job, which is intriguing. But I guess what it does mean is that me and my team have got some work to do. So so I think that's probably a positive. So no, just a bit of interesting local context. One thing that we have seen in terms of HSMs specifically is an expansion in terms of use cases. So historically, PKI and payment transactions were where we always saw HSMs in the past. That was the kind of dominant force in terms of HSM usage. But we're absolutely seeing that change, and we're seeing more and more HSM use cases coming to the fore. So, you know, people doing things like blockchain implementations with HSMs, you know, creating credentials for IoT devices. We're absolutely seeing that in a local context. And also applying encryption and digital watermarking to things like streaming video. You know, there are some really diverse use cases out there for HSMs that just didn't exist a few years ago. The other thing that we're also seeing as well, and I'm interested on whether people out there are seeing the same thing, is that we're seeing a trend for deploying, instead of moving away from deploying HSMs for each individual application, having silos of HSMs, enterprises appear to be favouring a kind of internal crypto as a service model, where they create pools of HSMs that their application teams can draw crypto services from. And this is often because enterprises have felt the pain of that siloed approach, particularly when it comes to staffing and resourcing. You know, typically people who know this stuff are very well sought after. So to get that resource all in one place and make it available to the whole business, I think is something that organisations are absolutely recognising. So, on that basis, I know it's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour in the because of the timing that we have, but let's talk a little bit about some of the recommendations. So the first thing to say is that the pay to multiple encryption solutions is certainly being broadly felt. So the advice that we would give is look for ways to get policy consistency and simplify life for your admins. You look for encryption tools that can span your data center and multiple clouds, rather than having a different tool for each thing. I'd also say that we mentioned that the threat of employee mistakes can lead to breaches, significantly so. So don't get super focused on the outside so much so that you forget about the inside. Both are important, and you can help your cause with some of the points that I mentioned around reducing the number of tools that your team has to learn. Security needs to be a collaborative effort. Again, we touched on this briefly during this short presentation. We've seen a lot of organizations that are moving towards centralizing their crypto operations so they can pool resources in enterprise, and that's absolutely something that we would encourage people to do. And then finally, encryption, if you do it right, can be what saves you in many cases when all the other security measures fail or get bypassed. But it's important that you keep the keys secure and away from the data, and perform good hygiene. So do regular key rotations and backups and all that sort of good stuff that we know really makes a difference and separates a good encryption policy from a poor encryption policy. You know, so to encapsulate it, I'd say do encryption right or don't do it at all. So, as I say, a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'm aware we've covered quite a lot of ground in that time. So, a copy of the full survey is available. So, please do take the opportunity to download it. I hope this was of some use for you. And yeah, I think on that basis, I will hand back to David.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. That was a great presentation, full of quite a lot of thinking points, and I'm sure that it's been both educated our viewers and piqued their curiosity as well. A reminder to viewers, if you have questions for James based on the presentation or anything else, just be sure to enter them in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll come back to them later on in the webinar. Now, we want to run just the first of our 2 poll questions, just to get a sense of some of the issues and the practices of our viewers out there. You're going to see the question on your screen. If you could just take a moment to click the most appropriate answer. And with this question, we're basically just trying to get a sense of how widely applied encryption has been in your environment. This is basically 1/3, 2/3, or all of it, or none of it. Which hopefully no one will say, but there may be some of those coming as well. So let's just take a moment to get some responses. Let everybody have a chance to put in their answers, and we'll see what's going on out there. So, what percentage of your data is currently encrypted by protected by encryption at rest? Okay, this is about what we would expect. So, a number of people are just getting into it. A number of people are completely there. All of it. That's very, very impressive to have that all sorted out. Everybody else is kind of in between. Looks like we're in that mid-range, certainly 55% between 1/3 and 2/3 of their data as encrypted at rest. So that's a very good illustration of the progress everyone's made in getting towards this ideal. One of the other questions, of course, is does all the data need to be encrypted? And we'll talk about that a bit later on. But thank you very much for your participation. Now I want to introduce our next guest, which is Mark Gregory. Dr. Mark Gregory is an associate professor in the School of Engineering at RMIT University in Melbourne, where he focuses on network engineering and internet privacy and security. He completed his PhD at RMIT University in 2008, co-authored a book entitled Security in the Network Society in 2013, and has published more than 80 refereed papers. He's a regular conference speaker and a media contributor, and is managing editor of the Australian Journal of Telecommunications, and is general chair of the annual Australasian Telecommunication Networks and Applications Conference. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you, David.
Now, Mark, we've heard a great presentation about the adoption of encryption, some of the challenges people are facing. How critical has encryption become in protecting today's networks?
Well, encryption is really a baseline for doing business today. We need to ensure that our data, particularly the personal private data and also the intellectual property of the organization, is protected. And if we don't do that, we're going to find the organization's data is going to be all over the internet. So it's very important that we encrypt encrypt everything related to the business today.
Definitely a goal that a lot of our viewers are working towards as well, and some of them doing very well in that respect. So that's definitely deserves a gold star, but clearly a goal that we're aiming towards. Now, one of the disruptors recently has been the Internet of Things. These devices also should be using encryption, and their numbers are growing pretty rapidly. So what impact does their adoption have on the goal of rolling out encryption and managing it in a pretty effective way?
Well, one of the problems that we're facing globally and in Australia is self-regulation of electrical and electronic goods. And if we're looking at, for example, spectrum, we're seeing interference occurring right across the spectrum today from goods that have got the tick, saying that they're, that they're quite usable and that they don't create electromagnetic interference. Now, similarly, with the Internet of Things, one of the problems that we're already facing is that we've got devices that companies are selling where they claim that there's security and claim that there's encryption of the data. But what we're finding is that many of these devices don't have the encryption that you would expect. And where they do have encryption, it's very easy to circumvent. Also, the other issue, which we're seeing with older devices, is that they go out of date very quickly. And so you've got the problem of updating the firmware or managing certificates related to those devices. So this Internet of Things is going to be a major issue for security within organizations, and how do we actually manage the process of securing them, whether it's TLS or some other form.
Definitely an issue and something that people need to think about as they start introducing more and more devices. And even the question is what constitutes a device. Sometimes there are some flexible definitions, so definitely worth thinking about. Now, what can be done to simplify the process of key management? This was alluded to in a presentation. A lot of people are having some trouble with this. How can that be managed in a more effective way?
I think the key management process has to be identified in terms of what is it are you trying to secure, and what is the best approach to do that. So if you've got a cloud presence, you've got data in the cloud, you need to identify how that's going to impact upon your organization. If your organization relies upon VPNs or connectivity between sites, we need to think about how we're going to secure that, the connectivity, the information flowing between sites. If we're utilizing internal systems, internal servers, again, we need to think about, well, how are we going to secure the internal systems? Are we going to use a key management system, some type of HSM? Are we going to utilize a private key store in some way? And of course, if we're then looking at this whole IoT, we need to work out, well, what's our strategy for bringing that in? So what I'm saying is that one of the problems that organizations face today is trying to find a solution that fits all of the scenarios that we want to participate in and secure data and traffic going into and out of our organization. There's no point having data secured on a RIA-DB if you're then going to push that data out of the database and across the organization over an unsecure link. So that's just, the type of problem that we're faced with today.
So it's not just a question of where the data is sitting, it's the whole process and the data flow that ties in with the business process, and how do you protect that from end to end? I mean, do you think that's why so many companies aren't using key management in the way that they could? Simply, it's proving to be too complicated.
I think that there's really a couple of different layers in there. One of them is the perceived cost of key management and utilizing keys, because keys generally are used on a set lifetime. So it's the cost of utilizing keys and key management systems. It's also that trade-off between what we think we need to secure versus what we really should secure within an organization. And of course, we also have organizations that are not present in these surveys or polls simply because they do not want to get involved or to let people know that they are not actually doing it or using it, simply because they're not bothered. And we have this quite considerable hidden number of organizations that are not really participating in security as they should.
It's very interesting, and of course a lot of those companies are working with other companies, so there's a shared responsibility of sorts to get on top of this. What is the biggest risk around encryption that most companies are still continuing to miss?
Well, I think the biggest risk is related to the personal private data that the organizations have, and also the intellectual property of that organization. If either of those leak out of the organization, it can set a company back decades. The company may not recover from the loss of that information. So we need to think about what is the value of security in today's environment. We're also faced with legislation now in terms of what we're required to do, the GDPR, encryption, personal private data. And for organizations, we will slowly start to see government get tired of companies ignoring the requirements that the government has put into legislation. So what will happen is that companies will progressively find themselves being put in front of the courts. So how that's going to play out and impact in Australia, we have yet to really see. But there is a point where the government is going to get tired of companies coming up with excuses for not encrypting personal private data, at least.
Certainly makes sense, and I think that's a theme that everybody's dealing with. Now, what should today's viewers, everybody out there that's watching us now, be doing to their network to improve the overall security around encryption? What can they leave here and go and do to really improve things?
Well, I think the key thing is that, as we've seen with the recently released guidance provided by the government's security organisations, is that security should be multi-layered. We need to identify the different aspects of our network and our data storage and our applications systems, and then we need to implement a multi-layered approach to securing the network, the systems, and to implement segmentation, to implement the use of TLS right across the board within the organisation. It's that multi-layered approach that will provide the security that gives you the best practice. The key is to remember that it can be done relatively low cost, and there are organisations now that are providing guidance and assistance to small enterprise to actually implement this security that is needed. I think it's good that the government is now providing much more information and help for companies. If companies have issues or don't know what they should be doing, they can call up the government agencies and get assistance and advice. I think that companies should be doing that rather than just sitting hoping that they won't get noticed. I think that if you don't have some sort of a security strategy in 2019, the rate at which we're seeing incidents occur on the network, by 2020, there's going to be a problem within the organization.
Certainly, it's very true. Mark, thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your insights. A reminder to viewers, if you have questions for Mark, to submit them through the app, and we'll come back to them later during the Q&A panel session. Also a reminder about the handouts for you to download for reading later on. Now, we'd like to ask another poll question. As before, just read through the question and click on the answer that best fits your situation. We can only allow one response in these polls, so if more than one answer applies, just choose the best one. And of course, the question here is, what is the main way you currently manage your encryption keys across the enterprise? Through a formal key management system, widespread use of KMIP, relying on hardware security module protection, HSM, deferring to individual applications' own encryption, or using an open source or in-house solution. And we have some results. Looks like a bit of everything going on out there. That's very interesting to see. So some people are focused on the hardware protection, about half of everybody out there, which is a good number. A lot are working more in software and deferring to what the applications are there. So very interesting to see. 25% relying on open source or in-house solutions, so building your own, which is definitely not for the faint-hearted, but certainly there are some experts out there. So thank you for sharing. That's very interesting numbers to bring from that. And that kind of segues into our next guest. Now, our third speaker is Richard Brown. He's founder and managing director of Cogito Group. So he mentors and manages a team of engineers and developers that have successfully designed and deployed a number of projects built around public key infrastructure and related technologies like identity management, encryption, and data protection. Richard, thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
So Richard, what sort of customers are coming to you for help with their encryption strategies?
That's a good question, David. All sorts of customers, actually. We're located in Canberra and Wellington, so we see a lot of government use, of course, but also finance, health, education, really anywhere, though, that is storing data that has security, privacy, IP, or reputational risk. We're seeing that that is a good use case where people want to protect that data leaking out. So when you think about it, whilst not every organisation is doing it, almost all organisations should.
Definitely makes sense, and everybody will have their own drivers for it to get going and the level to which they want to pursue it. What are some of the biggest mistakes that companies typically make when they're working to build out their encryption environment?
The biggest mistake we see, and often we're brought in after the fact, is people trying to do it themselves, and that comes in two main forms. So people trying to do it themselves in terms of using untrained staff to do the implementation, but also trying to do it on the cheap. And what I mean by that is not using the right equipment and software. So that's where things like components like hardware security modules really come in to help in that space. And we're seeing that because companies are actually trying to cut the cost down, but they're not seeing the true sunk cost of using their own resources, which take a lot longer to get to that point where they've actually achieved the goal, but maybe they haven't even achieved it well. So you need to look at what sort of result and the usability that you're actually going to get from that solution if you do it in-house, or even if you're doing it with a provider. What am I going to get at the end of the day? You also need to consider the unknown issues around security and ultimately sustainability where you do it yourself. And that's a big part of actually selecting a provider if you were to use a provider. The thing about items like hardware security modules and key management solutions is that generally they've gone through very rigorous testing, and not just testing by the owners or the vendors of the product, but independent auditors and evaluators have generally given the tick of approval. And lastly, you need to look at the long-term sustainability of any solutions that you might implement yourself. You know, relying on that one person that built it to always be within your organisation is a recipe for disaster, really.
Definitely something to consider. There are more options than ever for actually acquiring these capabilities. Does encryption key management need to happen on premises, or can it be acquired as a service to make it easier for ongoing management and deployment?
It can really be either or a combination. For organisations that don't do it often or at all, in fact, we recommend to outsource that management. Of course, I would say that because we're an outsourcer, but we recommend doing any outsourcing with a few provisos. The first is that you actually do need to build some of the requirements yourself, and that's not requirements around what the encryption will be, but just the type of data that you're protecting, the type of systems that might lie on. And that's the data, that's the information you will already have. And then you need to ensure that any outsourcer has the protection strategies for what you require. And you should be looking at things like their use of hardware security modules, right? And that's not just for protection, it's also for making sure that you get the performance that you're after, because that's one of the things that people don't realize about hardware security modules. They are designed to not just protect your key, but actually allow it to perform better than it would be performing on a standard piece of hardware. You also need to look at the key management software platforms that they might have for managing those keys. It needs to have things like, yes, it needs to maintain the keys, but it needs to give you information about what they're for. It needs to have rollover capabilities, those sorts of things. And another one would be the policy structure of the organisation for managing keys. So we talk about a key management policy, and they should have a really good policy. So you can ask questions around that key management plan or policy around that they have it and that they can actually tell you things about it. Other things that you should be aware of is that organisation audited, or are you planning to audit your own organisation? Should it be done internally? It's a really good idea, and any outsourcer would actually have audits in place by independent providers to make sure that data is protected. And probably lastly, I would actually consider that, so you don't make a mistake, just know whether there's any sovereign requirement there. So does the solution need to be in country where it's going to be outsourced? And just as important as where it's placed is who has access to that. So those administrators within that outsourced solution, are they citizens of that same country? Because that's very important. There's no use having a solution in a country if the access is actually by people that aren't citizens of that country and is from outside of that country. You really haven't achieved anything.
Definitely a lot of issues to consider. How can businesses future-proof their encryption key management systems? Because of course there are advances in quantum computing. We're talking about probably 5 to 10 years before a workable computer can basically break a lot of the encryption that's in place now. So you're going to need to build a future path into the environment. How can that be done effectively, and what should people be doing now?
The biggest thing that I recommend for organisations is to have a roadmap. Even if that roadmap isn't funded, just having it so that you know what the next step would be if funding does become available, or if the importance of some of the data increases, or just the risk does. So where you've actually got an outsourcer to, I'd recommend actually seeing that they've got a roadmap, and that given the fast moving environment this is, their roadmap should be very, very deep. So they should have a lot of things that they're hoping to achieve themselves, and things like the use of quantum resistant algorithms should be on their list. And if it's not, I'd really question whether they're actually moving forward or not.
Definitely a lot of things to consider there. Thank you very much, Richard, for your time. I'd like to now move on to the Q&A panel session. We've been mentioning this before, so of course this is the opportunity to get some of the viewer questions that we've been getting in front of the panel. So if I could invite Mark and James to come back on as well. We've covered a lot of ground so far this morning, and I'm sure that you've all been taking lots of notes and asking questions. Now, you still can ask questions, put them into the panel there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before the session finishes. Now, if we could start with Mark, one question we had: how can encryption be rolled out over networks and applications that are heterogeneous, and there's a lot of legacy components as well? How do you sort of provide a consistent environment for that?
I think that we've had some examples that is, depending upon the application or system that you're looking at securing, the use of a HSM or a key management solution. There are a lot of them available now. One of the difficulties that we have is to identify one that fits our, our needs, whether it be a Microsoft solution or AWS or even a smaller localized solution. There are a lot of them. So it does help to get some advice on what is a practical, low-cost way of doing this for the organization. There's been a lot of discussion, of course, recently about how you implement a key solution utilizing Let's Encrypt, which is providing free public keys now. So we need to look at, well, is there a solution that's going to support that environment if we want to go down that path of utilizing free keys within our management system? Internally, I think that the important thing is to make sure that the key management is going to work for the types of systems that you use. So if your organization is primarily using databases or internal file systems, then find something that's going to work for those platforms. And so often it's a call to the vendor that's provided the systems and asking them for advice on a solution that's going to work with that environment.
Fair enough. We had a question, what's the impact of quantum computing on current encryption standards and PKI?
Yeah, look, can I jump in there? There's some really interesting things happening at the moment, especially in that PKI space and the and quantum resistant algorithms. So some of the RFCs that are coming out, they're quite draft at the moment, the request for comments. But what's occurring is the industry is grappling with the idea of, can we actually put quantum resistant algorithms inside a package in a certificate that actually is also legacy capable? So you're actually seeing the first instances, and we're working on this ourselves, the idea of an RSA based certificate having embedded inside it a quantum resistant key as well. So when the technologies become available from the applications that will consume them, those things will work immediately. And that's pretty exciting. We're having a lot of fun with that at the moment, if I can call it that. Yeah, so yeah.
If I can just come in on that, I think that a key here is the idea of providing enhanced encryption, but also to ensure that legacy systems don't become, less secure or easier to break, or in fact that we move away from supporting legacy systems with some of the newer systems. So, as was said, it's a matter of finding a solution that supports both approaches as we move from one era to the next era.
Thanks. James, now there's been discussion about the different approaches being taken here, and we saw in the poll that there was a spread of approaches, both software-based and hardware-based. When is it necessary to step back from software-based key management and consider moving to a hardware-based solution?
Sure. Well, I guess one of the things that I was really encouraged to see clearly is that the number of the amount of HSM use was from the audience was just about exactly the same as across the country as a whole. So so nice to see that. But I guess my perspective on this is that keys have been proved time and time again to be often the weak point in any encryption implementation. So you could put forward the contention that why would you encrypt at all if you aren't going to protect and manage the keys properly? And in my opinion, that means using hardware. And I think that's very much supported by the fact that more and more of the regulation that we're seeing, not only locally, but also around the world, is now demanding that there is some robust key management in place, and often asking for FIPS standard protection for encryption keys. So the regulators appear to be sharing that view. But I think the great news is as well from a user perspective is that more and more application providers are now catering for this. So they're not only building encryption solutions into what they're providing, but they're also making it very easy to implement hardware-based encryption and key management solutions into it as well. They're kind of making that fairly seamless, which is really encouraging to see.
That's great. Richard, we had a question. How do you help companies build a business case around the widespread use of formal encryption practices?
Well, sometimes you actually do it for them. We have been often brought in to actually build that business case. But the first thing we'll do is we'll talk to them about the things that need to be done. you know, because you need to really justify the cost is a cornerstone of any business case, you know, not just identify the need, which is very important, but identify the cost and the relationship of the cost of what you're about to do potentially compared to the cost of losing that data. And as Mark said, that might be as much as the end of an organisation. So that's a pretty significant cost to, you know, to put in that business case. Reputational risk is part of that, as well as the value of the reputational loss. What is the value of that? And we sort of help them understand what can be done as well. So putting in not just the need, the cost, but also how we can actually improve the current situation. And really there's an amazing amount of technologies out there that can really help now. And as James said, the amount of applications that have embedded or the ability to use HSMs and key management solutions, it's very heartening, I guess.
Definitely, a lot of approaches, and it's great to see. Now, Mark, what protection should be built into a network architecture to deal with cases like where we've seen digital certificates have been compromised or fraudulently issued? Obviously, that sort of breach or risk has some follow-on impacts. So how can we plan now to minimize that?
Well, so it's about layering. It's about layering our defence to ensure that we utilise certificates that will get access to or be used in one part of the organisation that's not going to provide us with access to other parts of the organisation. So there's no simple approach where we're going to use one key to provide us with access to, you know, to a range of systems within the organisation. So if we go with the layering approach, and if we utilise professional products like HSMs that are available on the market, and we've heard about one provider today, the reliability that we would expect in that environment is going to be much higher than if we try and implement an open source solution where we don't really know what we're implementing, and we might get it wrong, which then leads to our keys or our private key store being, being compromised. The number of organisations that are leaving their private keys in locations that can be compromised is quite large at the moment, and many organisations don't realise that they need to ensure that they secure that side of it. Otherwise, people are going to get in, find those keys, and then that's it. They've got access to every aspect of the organisation.
Not the ideal scenario, certainly. James, when you deal with clients in a range of industries, range of sizes, a range of sophistication around encryption, are clients typically deploying key management systems because they're being truly proactive about security, or do you get a lot of people that come and say, we just got breached and we want to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think, speaking from a personal perspective, there's no doubt that there's been a change in attitude and approach over the past couple of years, and particularly with a view to data protection. So most of the customers that I speak to now absolutely understand the value of their data, and perhaps more importantly, they understand the value of their customers' data. So certainly I'm seeing that they're much more forward thinking in terms of building data protection strategies. And in fact, what we're now seeing is people going a step further. So organizations are often seeing having a good, robust, provable data protection strategies being a competitive differentiator for them. So that's something that we're certainly seeing. So no, I think it's very gratifying to see that organizations are not waiting to be breached. They're being far more proactive in terms of building a data protection strategy.
Definitely encouraging. So thank you to all the panelists for your involvement in this session, and thank you to all the viewers for your fantastic questions. Encryption is one of those challenging areas that sounds great in theory, but it can be complex and challenging to implement and maintain. It has, of course, become a frontline defense in ensuring the privacy of your critical data, but it's also increasingly become assumed that all data will be encrypted both in transit and at rest. As we've seen and heard, that ideal is still out of reach for many companies today. New applications, cloud-based storage, and expansion in the use of end-user devices, and the introduction of ever larger numbers of Internet of Things, sensors, and other devices will all challenge the desire to build a unified, resilient encryption infrastructure. With the proliferation of business applications using encryption and signature techniques, and a sheer number of entities that need encryption keys to identify themselves, it's clear that a formal policy-based key management architecture is more important than ever. Without one, you're leaving your applications and your data open to compromise, and this has increasingly serious implications for corporate governance, risk, and compliance practices. By ensuring you have enterprise-grade encryption in place now, you can save heartache and more in the future. Once again, I'd like to thank webinar sponsors nCipher for making this event possible, and to also thank all of you viewers for spending time with us today. We look forward to seeing you again next time.